How do you do, ladies and gentlemen? I'm here because I hope that you may share our enthusiasm and conviction that we have created something more than a motion picture. Within the pages of this remarkable book, General S.L.A. Marshall has told in blunt and blistering language the whole truth about the Battle of Pork Chop Hill. On the map, only 237 feet high. On the screen, it towers above every war story ever told.
King 6, douse those lights. You want to murder us? Turn off those damn lights.
10 years after John Wayne turned up in Sands of Iwo Jima, American audiences were presented with a more dignified and low-key version of the Wardaddy stereotype, courtesy of Gregory Peck in Lewis Milestone's 1959 war drama Pork Chop Hill. Admittedly, Pork Chop Hill is not a particularly famous film, but it's worth looking at because it's often held up as the forerunner to the more realistic war films that we see today. Once again, to understand the rationale behind the casting decisions, we need to understand the context of the film itself. Pork Chop Hill is set in the final days of the Korean War, which was the first of several US-led interventions in Asia intended to prevent communist-inspired independence movements from establishing themselves in the power vacuum left behind by the Japanese withdrawal. At the end of World War II, Korea had been divided into Soviet and US occupation zones along the 38th parallel, and it's fair to say that no one in Korea was particularly thrilled by this arrangement. In 1950, a North Korean army led by Kim Il-sung invaded the South in an attempt to unify the country by force. In response, the US managed to cobble together a multinational UN force to prop up the South Korean government. Under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, the United Nations troops carried out a very successful counteroffensive of their own. But when they came too close to the Chinese border, the People's Liberation Army was sent in to prop up the North Koreans. The PLA managed to push the UN troops back to the original dividing line, and from that point on, the war pretty much ground to a halt. In an effort to break the deadlock, the US resorted to a campaign of strategic bombing. Over the following months, the US Air Force leveled every city in North Korea with high explosives and wiped out hundreds of towns and villages with incendiary bombs and napalm. When that didn't work, they tried to starve the North Korean population into submission by destroying their fishing fleet and by bombing dams and levees to flood rice paddies and farmland. The battle for Pork Chop Hill, depicted in Milestone's film, took place in mid-1953, after the war had been stalemated for almost 2 years. Stop-start peace negotiations were starting to make headway, and both sides had recently agreed to an initial exchange of prisoners. But to show that they still meant business, Chinese commanders launched one last offensive against the UN lines in central Korea. Hill 255, shaped like a lump of meat, was one of several outposts that had been won and lost over the previous months, and on its own it had no real strategic importance. Nevertheless, on this occasion, US commanders decided to dedicate several companies to its defence for pretty much the same reason that the Chinese had decided to attack it, because they didn't want to be perceived as weak during the negotiations. Milestone's film was based on a forensic account of this battle compiled by historian Samuel Marshall and published in 1956. Gregory Peck's production company bought the rights to Marshall's book soon after it was released, and Peck eventually settled on Lewis Milestone to direct. Although he was getting on in years, Milestone seemed like a good choice for this sort of project. He'd served in the US Army Signal Corps as a documentary filmmaker during the First World War. He'd won an Academy Award in 1930 for adapting Eric Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front, and he'd made a bunch of anti-fascist propaganda films during the Second World War. Looking back, it can be hard to appreciate how groundbreaking Pork Chop Hill actually was at the time. Most war movies up to that point were shot on sound stages with pretty primitive special effects, and there was usually some sort of romantic subplot to ensure the film had broad appeal. Pork Chop Hill, on the other hand, was filmed on location in the hills around Los Angeles, with a lot of pyrotechnics and an all-male cast. The movie provided audiences at the time with a fairly gritty, ground-level view of infantry combat, without much in the way of home-front drama or political commentary. Scenes of battle take up most of the film's runtime, and even though there's not much gore, it's very intense by 1950s standards. It's very much the Black Hawk Down of its day. While the film is set in Korea, Pork Chop Hill is notable for the fact that it doesn't actually feature any Koreans. Neither does the film give you much political context for the war itself. The most you get are a few brief scenes set at the negotiating table in Panmunjom. Towards the end of the film, we see Chinese officials stonewalling the peace talks, and I think we're supposed to be appalled by their callousness. But when you consider what the US Air Force had been doing to North Korean civilians for the previous 2 years, this looks like the politest possible reaction you could have to a lecture from a US official on the sanctity of human life.
Don't you feel some responsibility towards thousands of...
Rather than geopolitics, the film is focused on the psychology of men in battle. Co-producer Cy Bartlett claimed that they made a conscious effort to avoid typical war movie cliches. We wanted people who saw the picture to say, this is the way it was, and these must be the real GIs we're looking at. But if authenticity was a priority, it certainly didn't extend to the casting. The average age of the actors in Pork Chop Hill is about 34, the oldest being Gregory Peck and Woody Strode, who were in their early 40s, and the youngest being Robert Blake, who was 25. And this age bracket is not due to the film having an ensemble cast of A-list actors. Most of the supporting cast were pretty much unknown at the time, even though some of those actors went on to have long careers in Hollywood. Harry Dean Stanton makes a brief appearance at the age of 32, and a young Rip Torn also turns up in the background. But when Pork Chop Hill went into production, the only big name attached to the film was Gregory Peck. And, as you would expect, he chose to play the lead role, Lieutenant Joseph Clemons, a company commander in the US Army's 31st Infantry Regiment, who was briefly tasked with defending the hill. In terms of historical accuracy, Peck's decision to cast himself in the company commander role screwed things up from the outset, because Peck was 42 when the film went into production, while the actual Lieutenant Clemons was 24 when he was deployed to Korea. That age difference might not have mattered so much, but Peck decided to portray Clemons pretty much like every other character he played during his career, as a sort of stern but wise father figure weighed down by the burden of command. If you've seen him in To Kill a Mockingbird, then you can pretty much imagine him here, Atticus Finch in a helmet. But in this case, Peck arguably took his world-weary persona a little too far, because for most of the film he appears so calm and collected that you're not even sure if he actually understands what's going on.
Make that casualty report 40%. It's murder over there. You clear out a bunker and try to move ahead, and they filter in behind you.
Yeah. It's been the same kind of murder with us.
Better bring up the 3rd platoon, Joe. We're stretched mighty thin.
Milestone clearly thought so too. He and Peck argued at length over how to play Clemons, with the director pushing for a little more anxiety and a little more urgency in Peck's performance. Here we see a picture of Milestone, presumably trying to explain to Peck that he needs to act less like a 42-year-old who woke up on the wrong side of bed, and more like a 24-year-old who's having the worst day of his life. Part of the reason for this stoic portrayal of Clemons was that by the time filming was underway, Peck had become friends with the real Joe Clemons, who had been granted leave by the Army to serve as an advisor to the production team. And Peck clearly admired Joe and wanted to portray him in the style of a classic Hollywood hero. And so that's what he did. Over the course of the film, we're presented with a middle-aged commanding officer performing the classic Wardaddy role, leading from the front, reassuring young soldiers, quelling unrest amongst the troops, and strategizing with his NCOs. Peck's idea of a good commanding officer was one who practices what we might call gentle parenting. He hears out complaints from his subordinates and barely raises his voice, even in the midst of combat.
Sue him.
He's especially patient with the youngest member of his unit, Private Veely.
Well, sir, I started down the hill, and damn it, I decided those chinks aren't going to push us off. So I turned around and I came back up again.
Who do you think you are? Audie Murphy? Turn around again. You're no good up here with one arm.
The most dramatic moment of the film comes in the 3rd act, when Clemons runs into one of the less enthusiastic members of his company.
10 years, you say. Real quick like you said.
10 years for what? Because I don't want to die for Korea?
But even this tense standoff barely elicits any reaction from Peck.
Chances are you're going to die like it or not. So am I, whether you shoot me or not. At least we've got a chance to do it in pretty good company. There's a lot of men came up here last night. They don't care any more about Korea than you do. A lot of them had it just as rough at home as you did. They came up and fought about 25 of them left. It's a pretty exclusive club. But you can still join up. If you want to. I'm going to move, Franklin. Make up your mind.
In reality, there wasn't much opportunity for Clemons to stave off mutinies or inspire his men during the battle itself, and that's because his unit came under artillery fire before they'd even reached their assigned positions, and they spent the next 20 hours under more or less constant bombardment. For most of that time, Clemons was effectively trapped in his command post while his men were scattered along the hillside in collapsed trenches and shallow craters. Unlike what you see in the film, the actual battle for Porkchop Hill was pretty much one long artillery duel, with Marshall estimating that about 80,000 shells were fired at Hill 255 over the course of the battle. Between bombardments, Clemons' men fended off assaults by Chinese infantry, but it was the artillery that did most of the damage. By the time Clemons was ordered to withdraw, 128 out of the 135 men he'd started out with were either wounded or dead. In his book, Marshall acknowledged the impossibility of the task Clemons had been given, but he still criticised the young lieutenant for not conveying the severity of the situation to his commanders. At several points during the siege, Clemons requested reinforcements but failed to mention how many casualties he'd taken. It was only when senior commanders realised that he was hanging on with a handful of survivors that he was given the order to withdraw. All in all, I think it's fair to say that the outcome of the battle had very little to do with Clemons' decisions, good or bad. But again, that's not what we see in Porkchop Hill. Instead, we're presented with a pretty much faultless depiction of military leadership.
Let go of me! Will you let go of me? I said, come on!
Porkchop Hill was not a massive success at the box office, but it wasn't a flop either. The film was praised by critics, and it certainly raised the bar in terms of showing how combat could be depicted on the big screen. Judging from reviews at the time, a lot of people who watched Porkchop Hill came away thinking they'd seen an authentic representation of infantry combat. But if you want to know what a US infantry company deployed to Korea actually looked like, the film you should watch is a little-known war drama called Cease Fire. Directed by Owen Crump, Cease Fire was produced in partnership with the US Army while the war in Korea was still in progress, and it features actual soldiers from the US 7th Infantry Division. Like Porkchop Hill, the narrative centres on a patrol sent out to capture a mountain in the final days of the war, and a lot of the dialogue consists of soldiers fretting over the possibility of being wounded or killed on the eve of a ceasefire.
That's a tough break anytime, but on the last day.
Despite its awkward pacing and dialogue, Crump's film still has a certain documentary quality to it. The soldiers involved in the production used their real names, and the combat scenes were staged using live ammunition and artillery. And yet somehow the net result is still pretty underwhelming. According to the film's producer Hal Wallace, the standout performer was a 19-year-old Texan by the name of Ricardo Carrasco. Wallace actually went so far as to offer Carrasco a contract with Paramount, but the young private turned him down, insisting that he just wanted to finish up and get back to his unit.
Carrasco, take that name tag off your helmet.
Carrasco's last day of filming was on July 6, 1953, and he was killed in action at Porkchop Hill later that day.
Sir, they're behind us, everywhere, a million of them.
All right, plug up these holes. Sandbag.
The famous American war correspondent Richard Tregaskis has this to say about our picture. As a correspondent who saw Porkchop Hill at the time of some of the battles there, I can say this is it.
Nowadays, I think most people would look at Porkchop Hill and recognise that it was pretty sanitised. But the real problem with Porkchop Hill is not the lack of violence or the lack of historical accuracy. It's the garbled message of the film itself. Ultimately, Peck's performance didn't really gel with what Milestone set out to do. When he was brought on to direct the film, Milestone saw an opportunity to make a thoroughly downbeat anti-war film, a companion piece to All Quiet on the Western Front. Because what Milestone saw in Korea was another grueling war of attrition, which had dragged on for years, consumed millions of lives, and ended with a return to the status quo. By using the contest for Porkchop Hill as a metaphor for the war as a whole, Milestone wanted to highlight the futility and cruelty of spending lives just to demonstrate some sort of political resolve. Instead, Peck used his influence to override Milestone and take control during post-production. He watered down the film's political commentary in the editing suite, cut a bunch of scenes that showed the battle from the Chinese perspective, and added a voiceover to the final scene which attempted to put a positive spin on the disaster.
Millions live in freedom today because of what they did.
When you combine all that with a cast of men in their mid-30s, you get a very misleading impression of what this war actually looked like. Peck was proud of Porkchop Hill, calling it one of his favourite pictures. Years later, he told an interviewer that, "We made a realistic war film, without sentimentality, without mum's apple pie, without letters from Sally out in the old hometown. I like it because of the extreme, tragic irony." Milestone, on the other hand, more or less disowned Porkchop Hill, dismissing it as just another war film.